Good morning, I'm Greg Jennett and welcome to our Anzac Day coverage from the Australian War Memorial here in Canberra. Behind me, the tomb of the unknown soldier, and inscribed to the left and the right, the names of each we do know to have died in armed service of this nation. Now, the big centenary anniversaries of World War I have come and gone in recent years, but this Anzac Day in 2019 retains the same simple purpose as the very first, which is to pause, to remember and to honour the fallen, as Australians here in the capital, across the country and around the world are doing in number and in spirit today. The 25th of April has delivered another sparkling autumn morning across the Capital Territory, from the parade ground here at the War Memorial, down along Anzac Parade and all the way to Parliament House and the mountains beyond. Now, a crowd has slowly built throughout the morning and the Anzac March will soon begin. So over the next couple of hours, we'll bring you live all the formal Anzac Day proceedings and commemorations in this, the national service from the Australian War Memorial. We'll also introduce to you shortly our panel of experts, Michael Kelly and Phil Rutherford. But the first order of proceedings, formally at least, is being introduced now by the Master of Ceremonies, Scott Bevan, here at the War Memorial. It will involve the Turkish Vice Admiral Regiment. He's the commander of the Turkish fleet, and he'll be delivering Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's 1934 reconciliation message to visitors from Australia, from New Zealand and Great Britain. Of course, General Ataturk commanded the 19th Turkish Division and ultimately went on to become the founding president of what we would now call modern Turkey. And there have been a few incidents overnight. Australians would have woken to the news of a little security concern surrounding the Gallipoli Dawn service, which is due to begin in about 2 hours from now. But most assurances appear to be that calm and security has been restored around the peninsula. So the Vice Admiral will be delivering his message, first of all in his native tongue of Turkish, and then that will be relayed in an English translation immediately afterwards. So we'll cross now to Vice Admiral Tatlıoğlu of Turkey.
Vice Admiral Tatlıoğlu, Commander of Turkish Fleet. Bu memleketin toprakları üzerinde kanlarını döken kahramanlar. Burada bir dost vatanın toprağındasınız. Huzur ve sükun içinde uyuyunuz. Sizler Mehmetçiklerle yan yana koyun koyunasınız. Uzak diyarlardan evlatlarını harbe gönderen analar. Gözyaşlarınızı dindiriniz. Evlatlarınız bizim bağrımızdadır. Huzur içindedirler. Ve rahat rahat uyuyacaklardır. Onlar bu toprakta canlarını verdikten sonra artık bizim evlatlarımız olmuşlardır. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives. You are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us, where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. Thank you.
So those words of General Ataturk have actually been quoted back and forth amid some friction between Australia and Turkey recently. Joining our commentary again this year are two distinguished and knowledgeable experts on military life and these special Anzac occasions, and are themselves former servicemen. Michael Kelly, an historian from the War Memorial, and retired Major Phil Rutherford. Phil served in Vietnam, Malaysia and in Singapore, and is a former research officer with the Army History Unit. Welcome to both of you. Michael Kelly, first of all, 2019 marks a number of significant anniversaries coinciding with conflicts and wars Australia's been engaged in. Which principally are they?
Good morning, Greg. Yes, this year we see upcoming the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the invasion of Europe by the Allies. Following on from that, we are also commemorating later in the year Operation Market Garden, which was the Allies' attempt to get into Germany during September of the same year. Looking into more modern conflicts, we've got the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Binbar, and also we're commemorating this year the 20th anniversary of the deployment of Australian forces to Interfet.
20th anniversary of that East Timor deployment. It doesn't seem very long ago now at all to some of us. Phil Rutherford, the Battle of Binbar, referred to there by Michael Kelly, actually relates parallels almost with the beginning of your deployments overseas. What can you tell us of its significance?
Yes, good morning, Greg. The Battle of Binbar took place a couple of days before I arrived in Vietnam in 1969, and I got to speak with a number of the combatants at that who took part in that. Our unit was also involved in that, plotting the intelligence movements of the 33rd NVA Regiment as it progressed into our area of operations, and were in fact a catalyst in sending the task force out to meet the enemy, and
pivotal in that sense.
It was very much so. It was one of the last major combat operations so close to the Nui Dat base, and I think from then on the enemy realised that it was going to be a heavy task if they were going to try and attack our base.
Yep. Much more to discuss with Phil and with Michael as we watch the band move on to the parade ground. But for many here, this national service is the second they'll have attended today, following on, of course, from the dawn service held in the same venue. Now, just before the sun struck the War Memorial's eastern walls, a large crowd again had moved in here for the ceremony, forever linked to the Anzac's pre-dawn move onto the Gallipoli Peninsula. Here's a look back on this morning's vigil.
We assemble at this special place of remembrance on this day each year. We gather to honour their bravery, their courage, their selfless comradeship, and their sacrifice. These were the men who created for their homelands the spirit of Anzac.
We who are gathered here today in this dawn vigil remember with gratitude the men and women who have given and are still giving in our armed and supporting services all that is theirs to give in order that the world may be a noble place in which to live.
Today and every day, remember all those sacrifices, those who suffered yet fought on, and those who continue to do so.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago, lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
Beautiful scenes under illuminating skies here in Canberra earlier today, and a reading also given there by VC Corporal Donaldson. He's not the only VC in our company today. We'll talk about another a little later in our coverage. Now, queuing up along Anzac Parade are some dignitaries who will signpost just presently to indicate that the New Zealand High Commissioner, Her Excellency Dame Annette King, is in one of the vehicles lined up down the road there. She'll arrive shortly for what is her first Anzac Day service here in Australia in that role as High Commissioner. After her is Simon Birmingham, the Senator, who will be attending today's service on behalf of the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. Mr Morrison spent his dawn around Townsville and attending ceremonies there. I believe he's since moved on. Of course, this service falling within an election period. Bill Shorten, his opponent, was in Darwin this morning. And they are both moving on to, as you would expect, Anzac-related activities as the day goes on. Now, just briefly before the dignitaries arrive, we have another annual fixture here, which is the service honouring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who've served for Australia's forces since Federation. It's held after the dawn service at the base of Mount Ainslie, and the gathering is less formal than any other, but no less important to the many who attended.
On behalf of the Ngunnawal people and my Ngunnawal elders, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of my people, the Ngunnawal. I'd like to welcome you all here today. I'd like to pay my respects to those that have served, to those that are still serving, and those families that have honoured, loved and supported those people. The numbers here are just incredible, and it's a wonderful traditional ceremony that we have here in relation to commemorating our fallen.
For many years it was believed that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander commitment to serving the nation during times of war was seen as small. But this is now, through the work of dedicated people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, has been proven not to be so. Well over 1,000 now have been identified as serving in the First World War. We have served, we serve now, and we will always serve.
He waited for no call-up, he didn't need a push. He came in from the stations and the townships of the bush. He helped when help was wanting, just because he wasn't deaf. He is right amongst the fighting columns of the fighting AIF. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
Yes, so that Indigenous service is held at the base of Mount Ainslie in a bushy setting around the memorial plaque known as The Rock. Now we can tell you that Dame Annette King, the High Commissioner of New Zealand, has arrived in front of the Stone of Remembrance, and the next dignitary to pull up is about to make his way onto the parade ground shortly, and that would be Simon Birmingham, as we flagged earlier, the Prime Minister's representative today. And Michael Kelly, as we wait for that arrival. I think there's been some discussion, has there, about not upgrading, but perhaps moving the location for that Indigenous ceremony, growing as it does each year.
Very much so. With the new Indigenous art sculpture, which was just recently opened here at the memorial in the grounds, there's been talk about moving the ceremony there for next year, because over the last 15 years, the numbers attending the Indigenous ceremony up on the hill have grown exponentially, and were bigger again this morning from what I could see. And to have it down here, it's probably a lot safer as far as people's safety goes, but the setting will still be a very beautiful setting regardless.
Yeah, it sort of grew almost organically into what it is today from very humble beginnings, and that was, what, 10 or 20 years ago?
Nearly 30. It was, 1993 was the first one, and Gary Oakley, who we saw on screen earlier on, was one of the first to lead that ceremony, and he can take a lot of credit for how this has grown from grassroots.
So Simon Birmingham, soon to make his way here, Phil Rutherford, and after him, we may as well have a word about him now. Sir Peter Cosgrove, the Governor-General, will be making his way up here, and a very significant day for that individual when you consider his life's work in the military and as a public official in Australia.
You're right, Greg, and I think it'll be a very emotional moment for Sir Peter. He's a Vietnam veteran. He won a military cross in Vietnam for his actions. And he went on to lead the army as the chief of army, and then later moved on to the governor-generalship. He was a commander of the interfet forces that went into East Timor. So I think he'll look down in pride with the veterans marching by on that day, today.
So Simon Birmingham, wearing medals himself, greeted by the chairman Kerry Stokes of the Australian War Memorial and the director Brendan Nelson, and so there'll be a little ceremony surrounding Simon Birmingham's presence. And Michael Kelly, perhaps we can discuss that. Interfet, it's probably where Sir Peter came to public prominence, even though he'd been a senior commander in the military for a long time beforehand. It is an anniversary for Australia's deployment into East Timor. Looking back, what do you think of its significance? Yeah, so East Timor's significance as, I suppose, a wake-up call, I think some people say, to the Australian Defence Force, that there were things happening in our region and perhaps we were not quite ready for them. Just explain Interfet's significance.
Very much so. When I served, it was during a period of where the Army was very much looking inwardly. It wasn't expecting to look out. But by 1999, things had begun to change in the world, and our commitments had, obviously with Somalia, had started to change. But we were still called out when we had to deploy to East Timor. The Army basically wasn't ready to start fielding a large force on a rotating basis. So the Army did expand, and my old battalion, 89 RAI, which had been disbanded, was re-raised following this. And it also signified, Interfet signified a rapid change in what was going on in the world as well. And we soon found ourselves in Afghanistan and Iraq as well.
And as we wait for Sir Peter and Lady Lynn Cosgrove to move up, which they're now doing. Already perhaps breaking with protocol, down comes the window and out goes the hand. It is a significant moment, this, for Peter Cosgrove, a lifetime military man.
He's receiving a very good, very loud greeting from the crowd as well too.
We will be silent for his official welcome, Phil, but just briefly, did he remake the mould of the popular or populist commander with that Interfet deployment? He was certainly high profile.
I think he did, and I think he was certainly one of the first of our commanders who had to play a very strong political role in the raising of the government in East Timor and the creation of that country. And I think they owe him a great debt of gratitude.
we see it or did we imagine it? A slight tremble there, maybe, on the face of Sir Peter. He's 71 years of age, and in June we expect that David Hurley, his successor, will take up residence at Government House in Yarralumla. So it would only be a matter of weeks until Lady Lynn Cosgrove and Sir Peter shuffle out of that premises. They've actually spent recent Anzac days at events in Europe and last year in Papua New Guinea. So no doubt Sir Peter Cosgrove crossing off some significant military locations, as he would have been aware that either slightly before this Anzac Day or slightly after it, his term was going to expire.
I think he'd probably prefer to be known as not shuffling off but marching
Ladies
off.
and gentlemen, please be seated.
Good point. Yeah, so we're about to get an introduction from the Master of Ceremonies to Wing Commander Jonathan Lilly. He's a member of the Worimi people of Williamtown, just north of Newcastle. He's playing the didgeridoo, of course.
On the parade ground in front of the Stone of Remembrance was Wing Commander Jonathan Lilly, a member of the Worimi people of Williamtown, north of Newcastle in New South Wales. Thank you, Wing Commander Lilly, for that performance. Ladies and gentlemen, the Guard of Honour, mounted by the Australian Defence Force Academy and the band of the Royal Military College Duntroon, will now leave the parade ground.
Okay, so as the Guard of Honour dismounts or leaves the parade ground, we're going to take a moment to quickly look back on the way this event has been brought to you for more than half a century now. We're talking here about the broadcast of the National Service, the first of which began in 1965. And back then it was seen only by viewers in the southeast corner of the country, principally New South Wales and Victoria. And in the years that followed, the service and the way it's covered have changed in starkly different ways. Andrew Bell's been looking back on the 54 years between then and now.
Across Anzac Parade.
It was a sunny Sunday morning, that April the 25th. Around 15,000 people turned out. Canberrans who were at home tuned in on Channel 3. Others joined later via the coaxial cable.
We're happy and proud to welcome our viewers in Sydney and Melbourne.
TV's first live broadcast from this sacred spot was well timed.
Here at the Australian War Memorial, we mark the national commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the landing at Gallipoli.
And those who were there had pride of place.
Original Anzacs will be accorded the honour of marching on, approaching through the centre of the troops already on parade.
It was Sir Robert Menzies' last Anzac Day as Prime Minister, and a return to Australia for the Duke of Gloucester, who'd served as Governor-General in the mid-1940s. He spoke on behalf of the Queen.
For every generation of Australians and New Zealanders must grieve for the human sacrifice and will remember with gratitude the valor and devotion of those who lost their lives.
In the years that followed, the rest of the country would get to see and hear this most particular of ceremonies as it happened, the National Memorial living up to its name.
What a splendid sight this is from Canberra. And what a splendid day it is. Sparkling, crisp, cloudless.
All right, well, Phil Rutherford, that was 54 years ago now, almost as long as your military service. We are going to catch up in a moment with the leaders of today's march, but memories of your first Anzac Day, either in service or before you joined it, do they stretch back that far?
Thank you, Greg. Yes, they do. 53 years with a couple of years off for good behaviour. My first Anzac Day that I recall was as a very young child. My father had served 12 years in the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal Navy, attended the parade in Sydney, and it was a very moving affair. It was only the veterans. It was only the families were watching it, but it was a very solemn, a very moving affair, and that's kind of stayed with me ever since. It's ironic the band at the moment is playing the Old Contemptibles, which was written just after the First World War, in memory of the British forces that were called the Old Contemptibles by the Germans because they just refused to give up. And I think that's been one of the things with Anzac Day. It's just seemed to have refused to give up. It's always been with us.
Yep, tradition runs strongly here today, as in the years before. Now, the march is soon approaching, and it'll be led today, amongst others, by John King, the ACT president of the RSL, as well as Air Commodore Ian Moa, who's the New Zealand Defence Advisor to Australia. Now, they joined our reporter, Georgia Hitch, a short time ago.
John, just to start with, tell me a bit about how special this march is here for you today and how you see the march progressing into the future as, you know, generations continue to serve for Australia.
The march itself has changed over time. Will also change over in the future. The nature of operations these days sees a mixed military and public service operating in various capacities. And in the future, instead of people marching with individual units, we'll see that transcend into operational groups who've served at various times and places.
So you don't see this dwindling out? I think there's fears by many people that as the people that fought in World War I and World War II begin to die, that, you know, the legacy that they have left will be forgotten. Are you concerned about that?
I think over time there were many, many people dropping off the perch, as we put it, but they've always been replaced by younger and fresher groups. When they feel comfortable, they will march.
We're also joined by New Zealand Defence Advisor to Australia, Ian Moa. Ian, how special is it for you to be here today? And can you give us a bit of an idea of how this compares to marches in New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. Well, good morning. Look, it's a real privilege and pleasure to be here, to be honest. In terms of what we see here, we see very similar sorts of displays back in New Zealand. We see lots of Kiwis out there in the dawn services. We see commemorations and marches throughout the day. I think it's a day of deep reflection where people, Kiwis, think about the sacrifices that men and women have made in the past, but also more importantly, I think, of what it means to be New Zealand and Australians today and the freedoms that we enjoy. So it's a day of really deep reflection, I think, and very similar on both sides of the Tasman.
So also prominent this year in the lead of the march will be alongside John King and Ian Moa, who you both heard from a moment ago. It will also be Ben Robert Smith. He is the other VC recipient who we know to be in Canberra today after Corporal Donaldson, who was present at the dawn service. So be looking out for him, although he wasn't present with Georgia Hitch for any thoughts there.
Ladies and gentlemen, the guard on parade today is from the Australian Defence Force Academy, or ADFA. ADFA combines joint military education and training with academic study for an undergraduate degree through the University of New South Wales. Training for midshipmen and officer cadets over the past few weeks has included preparation for today's national ceremony here at the Australian War Memorial. And joining the guard is the band of the Royal Military College of Duntrue. Since its formation as an official army unit in 1954, The band of the Royal Military College has been at home on the parade ground and in the concert hall. The band provides musical support to defence establishments in the ACT, including the Corps of Staff Cadets at Duntroon. The band also performs music for all types of ceremonial, social and cultural activities, as well as being the official band for all regal, vice-regal, diplomatic and state functions that are held in the national capital. While we wait for the march to begin, by the end of the First World War, on land, sea and in the air, from a nation of less than 5 million people, 62,000 gave their lives in an Australian uniform. From a nation of just over 1 million people, about 18,000 New Zealanders were killed and more than 40,000 were wounded. In more than a century of service, the Australian and New Zealand Defence Forces have continued to serve together across the world in war and peacekeeping operations. Well, later today, you may wish to visit the memorial's commemorative area where poppies adorn the panels of the memorial's Roll of Honour. These have been placed beside names as a small personal tribute to the memory of a particular person, or in memory of all individuals commemorated there. This practice began at the interment of the unknown Australian soldier on the 11th of November 1993. As people waited to lay a single flower by the tomb in the Hall of Memory, they had to queue along the cloisters beside the Roll of Honour. By the end of that day, hundreds of poppies had been pushed into the cracks between the panels, bearing the names of the fallen. And the heart of the Australian War Memorial is the Hall of Memory. It's a quiet place for contemplation and remembrance of the efforts of ordinary Australians in war. Each one of the hall's 15 stained glass windows represents a defining quality of Australian servicemen and women, incorporating images of Australian soldiers, airmen, sailors and a nurse, all from the First World War. The windows were designed and constructed by Napier Waller, a Victorian artist who lost his right arm on the Western Front. The walls and dome of the hall are lined with one of the largest mosaics in the world. It's also the work of Waller, and it was unveiled in 1959. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please make welcome Royal Australian Navy veteran, Mr. Gerard Pratt, who will lead today's march commentary.
Okay, so that was Scott Bevan, the Master of Ceremonies, bringing us some historical perspective, particularly around the Hall of Memory here at the War Memorial. And then the march will begin momentarily. And Phil Rutherford, what do we first see? Who are we first looking out for as tradition would dictate? I think we know full well what leads.
As we've seen for many years now, Greg, from the left of the parade ground we will see Captain Mike Fitzgerald leading boy, who's a standard-bred gelding of indeterminate age. It's marked as the riderless horse. It's a tradition that goes back centuries to the days of Genghis Khan and other mounted warriors. When a great warrior was buried, his favourite horse would accompany the burial party, so that he had a horse with him. He had his favourite horse with him in afterlife. Famous leaders have been given this honour: Winston Churchill, President John Kennedy, Ronald Reagan. The tradition continued over the years with the horse generally dressed with a black saddlecloth or a caparison covering the saddle and led by a soldier known as a cap walker. The boots are reversed in the stirrups. They're thought to symbolise a commander looking back one more time at the soldiers that he once led. But today they symbolise the men and women who have lost their lives in combat, looking back one more time on the comrades who will be marching behind them.
And Mike Fitzgerald, as we watch him there, He's known to you, I think. Is he, Phil, as a
He is.
old colleague?
I've known Mike for many years. He was in the Royal Australian Corps of Signals with me many years ago, and he spent many years in the reserves. Today he's representing Lieutenant Commander Leighton Bracegirdle of the First World War, who's the Royal Australian Navy. He was the commander of the RAN bridging team, which was really the team that brought ashore the stores and ensured that troops got ashore at Suvla Bay safely. He was one of the last Australians to be evacuated from Gallipoli when all the forces were evacuated, and he went on for a very distinguished career after the war as the official secretary to 4 Governors-General.
And there he goes past the Governor-General.
As the troops go marching on, the band we'll start off with the March of the Anzacs. That was written by Alex Lithgow just after the First World War, who came out from Scotland and formed the Tasmania's 12th Battalion Launceston Regimental Band, which later became the 1240th Battalion Royal Tasmanian Regiment. The dedication of this particular march is obviously dedicated to the Anzacs.
So a homegrown arrangement, if you like.
Absolutely. The majority of the music played today by the band was written before the First World War, or in the late 1800s.
And we saw the Guard of Honour leave a little earlier. Phil, just to explain, they are from the Defence Force Academy this year. There's no presence here by the Federation Guard. Where are they likely to be when they're not here on Anzac Day?
The Federation Guard are generally part of Australia's official representation in formal gatherings either here or overseas. And as you appreciate, there are many official engagements overseas at the moment. The Fed Guard are actually here today providing the guides and the chaperones to the official dignitaries on the parade ground.
Yes, and as Phil Rutherford alludes to there, this is, of course, one of many services held not only around our country but across the world. As we watch the march begin, and we mentioned earlier the presence of VC recipient Ben Robert Smith, there we can see him leading the parade with John King and with Ian Mower.
John King's the interim president of the ACT Association. He was a national serviceman. He was called up in January 1971 and transferred to the Australian Regular Army, where he stayed until 1992 and then transferred to the Army Reserve. He's only just recently retired from the Army Reserve in 2012 and is now as the interim chairman of the ACT Association. Air Commodore Mao is the Defence Attaché to the New Zealand High Commission from the Royal New Zealand Air Force. They're followed by the Anzac banner, which is World War banner, and it's accompanied by members of the reenactment group.
That's the Anzac banner. Ben Robert Smith, just to round out the profile as he marches past. He, of course, received that VC for a battle in 2010 around Shawali Kot in Afghanistan.
Following them is for the first time, is the Officer Training Unit in Skyville. Their contingent leader is Lieutenant Colonel Les Boag, retired, who started with the CMF many years ago as 2 Commando. Skyville was the officer training establishment set up to train national service officers in 1964-65 and was the only officer training establishment in Australia to have a wet bar. Their cadets actually being older than the average cadets, so they were allowed to drink.
It's quite a claim to fame.
peacekeepers. This is the mixed group, peacekeepers and peacemakers. The first Australian peacemakers actually went away in September 1947 with 4 Australian military officers, becoming the first UN peacekeepers in the world to be deployed by the United Nations to the Dutch East Indies in Indonesia. They've since involved over 66,000 veterans who have participated in 73 operations in 64 different countries, non-stop up to the present day, with Iraq, Middle East, Afghanistan, Africa and the Solomon Islands. Following them, we have the Hellenic Club in their sub-branch of the RSL and their national dress.
Very distinctive.
Behind them, we can see the Vietnamese sub-branch of the RSL. They're led by Mr. Vai Tran, who was a sub-lieutenant in the Republic of Vietnam Navy. The uniform they're wearing is the uniform of the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam paratroopers. Following them, we have the Bribie Island Community Link, led by Mr. Laurie Leonard, the president. The community links ceased in the RSL community links ceased in 2017, but sub-branches of Harvey Bay and Bribie Island decided to continue with the blessing of the Queensland RSL. They represent any serviceman or woman who has since passed from any service and any campaign.
And then the first of our veterans to arrive via Jeep, Phil?
That's right. This is a tradition that goes back to the first Anzac Day when the wounded soldiers were not to be left behind during the marches. They were determined that they were going to go with their mates, so they were transported in motor vehicles, accompanied by their nurses. We've got now the first of the World War II contingents coming through. Sorry, we've got the New Zealand contingent. These are New Zealand personnel, veterans and serving members who were posted to Australia, then followed by the World War II Navy. As can be expected, their numbers are dwindling more and more each year.
Yes, it's marked, isn't it, this year? Not across the board, but certainly in the World War II ranks.
Well, as we can see, there's no veteran marching with them. They're relatives who are wearing their veterans or their predecessors' medals on their right chest. And in a similar vein, we have the Army veterans. In those ranks are perhaps some of the last of the Rats of Tobruk. There are very, very few in numbers today. Again, mostly made up of descendants of the veterans.
Yeah, decidedly youthful contingent there behind the Rats of Tobruk for obvious reason.
It is showing the way that the Anzac Day has morphed from where it was a march predominantly of the veterans to being descendants of the veterans who are representing their predecessors.
Does that represent a challenge in any way to the longevity and sustainability of this as a fixture?
I think it does. I think it'll see us questioning the meaning and the purpose of the march, although not certainly not the significance of the day itself. It will cause us to really consider exactly what the makeup of the march as the veterans, as we find that the veterans are no more.
And the Royal Australian Air Force.
I believe the contingent leader here is Mr. Ray Walker, who's a flying officer of the Bomber Command during the World War II. There is a large Air Force contingent in the ACT. Most RAF personnel are based at Canberra or at headquarters at Russell.
The anniversaries we were talking about earlier on with D-Day, 463 and 467 took great part in preparing the beaches and the areas behind the German lines with bombing operations to help get the Allies ashore.
But of course, very few of those servicemen actually remaining, Michael.
Very much so, yeah. I know we've only got in the ACT one Rat of Tobruk left, and unfortunately he's too unwell to march today, but their numbers are dwindling far too rapidly, sadly.
What is pleasing to see with the Air Force is the marching amongst some of the Air Force, the cadets from ADFA. A number of them wearing their predecessors' medals.
And that's the requirement, is it, Phil, that they must have that familial link in some way?
Yes, I've not
They're
seen
not
it
here
anything
by
written
virtue
down.
only of their current service with ADFA. They must.
They probably, I would say they volunteered to march with the Air Force contingent, given there's such a low number.
And then we move to the Malaya and Borneo veterans contingent, along with Sandakan families.
This is a group that was founded by Mr. Richard Webber, former Argyle and Southern Highlanders during World War II. He was captured and spent 2.5 years as a POW working on the Burma Thai Railway and emigrated to Australia in 1963 after the war. There were only 6 survivors of the Sandakan death march. Unfortunately, I don't believe any of them are with us today.
And then the war that you will associate strongly with Phil Rutherford, Vietnam veterans.
This is a combined veterans groups. There are a number of veterans groups around it, but this is a combined group. They represent all former as well as current members of the Defence Forces and their families. And they're from all 3 services, Army, Navy and Air Force. Following them is HMAS Sydney. Otherwise known as the Saigon Ferry. It was a converted aircraft carrier that took the troops to Vietnam and brought them back. It was commissioned in 1948. It was formerly HMS Terrible, which is an ironic name. Served in Korea 51-52, decommissioned in 58, and carried troops was recommissioned in 1962 to carry troops and equipment to and from South Vietnam. They're followed by HMAS Perth, which is a 6-inch gun light cruiser, served in the RAN from 39 to 42. The second HMAS Perth was Australia's first guided missile destroyer. Served for 34 years, including 2 trips including three deployments to Vietnam. It was the only Australian ship hit by enemy fire. It was awarded the United States Commendation and Meritorious Unit Commendations. Sorry, Navy Unit Commendation and Meritorious Unit Commendation. It was decommissioned in 1999 and scuttled off Albany as a dive site. Number 9 Squadron, RAAF, was under operational control of the 1st Australian Task Force in Vietnam. It was a very highly decorated group, with only 4 DSOs, 2 MBEs, 32 DFCs, 1 CGM, 1 GM, 9 DFMs. They're followed by the Airfield Defence Guard, responsible for defence of airfields here and around the world. Now in the post-1990 operations.
Almost modern times relative to the preceding contingents.
So looking at Somalia, this deployment happened whilst I was still serving with the 1 RAR battle group going over to serve around Baidoa, and They did a fantastic job, but a lot of the veterans came back and then would go, many stayed on and then would go on to Timor as well. The Timor group, as we can see here, marching behind, commemorating their 20th anniversary of deployment this year, and also the nationhood of East Timor, which Sir Peter can be very rightly proud of his part as well.
And from there,
following on from there,
we jump forward to Afghanistan.
Yeah, Afghanistan is also, we've had a couple of trips to Afghanistan with Iraq in between, but the Australian Defence Force have created a lot of goodwill in what they did amongst the local people, not only in combat operations, but in the rebuilding and reconstruction task forces as well. So did an amazing job and to continue to do so.
Yes, in and then out for a period of time before moving back in a big way to secure Uruzgan province.
Very much so. I know it's. I think Uruzgan is very much contested again these days, but when the Australians were there, it was, I mean, never ever pacified. But they did a fantastic job in keeping the local people as safe as they possibly could, considering the nature of the war.
Now, Iraq has a similar story, doesn't it, Michael? A number of deployments of different varieties. Some rarely stepped foot on land. They were in frigates predominantly off the coast in the Gulf, and then ultimately the conflict phases as well for the army and others.
Very much so. The initial Gulf contingent was entirely naval, doing blockade mainly. But when they went back again, it was both Navy and ground forces involved as well during the Gulf War. And then back in the early 2000s, we sent 4 RAR Commando and amongst other troops, plus the Navy contingents, clearance divers and things like that to assist as well. So we've had repeated modern day deployments to Iraq, but it also harks back to the First World War with the Mesopotamia contingent as well. So we've spent a lot of time in the Middle East.
And we have on active operation there contingents that remain at the Taji base, training Iraqi forces to this day. No doubt when the sun comes up in that part of the world, they'll be participating in their own dawn service today.
Marching past now is the Tingera Australia Association, and Tingera keeps the spirit of the HMAS Cerberus and HMAS Lewin junior recruits alive, looking at keeping on reuniting the classmates of former classes and ships. And of the people who've gone through, there's 13,000 junior recruits, which were boys aged 15 to 16, undertook training at this location between 1960 and 84. The Royal Australian Artillery contingent, which is on screen at the moment. The association's contingent consists of former and current serving artillerymen who have deployed from places like Vietnam through to current things like Afghanistan and Iraq as well. Our engineers, Royal Australian engineers, have deployed from all theatres through the First World War to current as well, and the current contingent here have got service from Vietnam, looking at through the current conflicts as well, looking at the medals on display today. Yes. And behind them, they've got the banner of the Royal Australian Engineers Association, ACT, which is 4 Field Troop, who've also had a long and distinguished service.
On screen now is my former commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Hart. He's a member of the RO6 group here that's coming through now. They're led by a banner party from 8 SIG Regiment, 143 Signal Squadron, which is based in Canberra.
Behind the signals is the banner of the Royal Australian Regiment, which I was a member of with the 89th Battalion. And the 8 RAR banner behind them is for their service in Vietnam. But the Royal Australian Regiment formed in 1948. It was given the Royal prefix in 1949 and had its first combat not long after during the Korean War, and serves today in all theatres, including in Taji, as we mentioned earlier on.
I think the Governor-General, who's remaining at the saluting dais, has association with it as well, stretching back to most of his military career.
And did serve as a member of 5RR in Vietnam. And behind the Royal Australian Regiment is the Special Air Service Association. And hello to Don Barnby, who's marching proudly there as well today. I know he'll have words with me afterwards for mentioning his name, but it's always great to see him on parade.
Too late now.
Behind the SAS are the Commandos Association. Commandos had a great service during the Second World War, and they became reserve formations in the ensuing years, but have been since 4RAR rebadged in 2009 to 2 Commando Regiment. The Commandos have current service in Afghanistan, Iraq and Timor as well.
In fact, have probably done more in the last 5, 7, 9 years than they've been deployed for decades.
Very much so. Very much they'd had done not much other than training, but these days they play a very active role in Australia's deployment alongside the Special Air Service Regiment as well. The Royal Australian Army Medical Corps, you cannot go on a deployment without your medics, who provide valiant and amazing service and continue to do so in conflict zones today as well. The Australian Defence Force Nursing also provide valuable support to the Medical Corps. The Nursing Association is led today by Lieutenant Colonel Kim Sullivan.
And if an army marches on its stomach, it only gets there via its teeth.
Very much so. We called them, I think it was fang wranglers, but you certainly can't go anywhere without dentists either, because there was no shortage of broken teeth with infantrymen, so they provide a valiant service as well.
Yeah, that's the Army Dental Corps Association.
The Royals behind them is the Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers Association, and they're led today by Colonel Larry Foley, who is also past Corps Director. The Australian Electrical Mechanical Engineers formed in 1942, and the royal title was bestowed upon them in 1948.
And what does that signify, having that bestowed upon you? Obviously patronage, but prestige, I suppose.
Very much so. I think that the royal title in any association or regiment is a great prestige and acknowledgement.
Coming through now is Major Bill Stefaniak, retired. He's a member of the 3rd Royal Australian Royal New South Wales Regiment, formerly a lawyer in civilian life and former leader of the opposition in the ACT Legislative Assembly. He's leading the Werra District Army Reserves, combined group from all the Army Reserve groups.
It's actually great to see him on parade today with his recent illness battles as well. So it's
absolutely.
He's had a rough trot, Bill Stefaniak, but within the ACT, very well known, because there's hardly a community group that he doesn't have linkages with somewhere through his career, military service, lawyer circles, etc. Very well known.
Absolutely. We're looking now at the Multinational Force Observers group. They were formed after the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, and they're still serving there in the Middle East.
And behind the Multinational Force of Observers, we've got the Australian Civilian Peacekeepers and Peacemakers from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Department of Defence and other government agencies that have served in warlike and non-warlike operations.
They're followed by the Army Headquarters contingent. They're parading today with the new Army banner, which was consecrated at the RMC Chapel on 20th of February 2019 and presented to the Army on the 1st of March on the Army's birthday. The banner party is Captain Ross Cullen and the Warrant Officer William Beatty and Sergeant David Allen. They're led by Brigadier Mike Burgess. They're followed by 460 Squadron, I believe, Royal Australian Air Force Intelligence Unit, active within the Defence Imagery and Geospatial Organisation. It was first formed as a heavy bomber squadron during World War II and disbanded after the war. It saw extensive combat over Europe. The squadron was a multinational unit, but most personnel were Australian. It was reformed in 2010 and is currently located in Canberra.
looking at the casualties that 460 Squadron suffered during the Second World War, the squadron suffered something in excess of 5 times its strength in casualties, so it basically was wiped out five different times and rebuilt and kept, well, the reinforcements that kept it full and flying, but
because they were flying what types of missions?
All sorts. They were flying bombing missions over Germany. They were doing mining operations in the English Channel, and basically were involved in basically trying to knock out the German war effort all over. But
the highly dangerous end of the spectrum.
Very much so. But the bombings of the cities in Germany and high-value targets also in France and Belgium during operations there as well. They certainly earned their accolades.
On screen at the moment is the South African Military Veterans Organisation of Australia. South Africa fought against the Germans in East Africa and on the Western Front, and against the Nusi tribes during the First World War. Most recently fought alongside the Australians in World War II and represent the veterans of the conflicts in South Africa.
And Turkey, we've mentioned Turkey a little in our coverage already. The lead up to this Anzac Day was not without a little friction, most of it politically motivated as far as we could tell, due to elections there, and not really due to elections here, but certainly there have been some tensions, and that's why there was that security concern surrounding today's Gallipoli dawn service, which we'll be getting to in just over an hour from now. But the Turkish community here, not to be deterred by any of that sort of chatter, and showing up in good number this year, 2019.
It's actually really great to see, because even though we had been enemies in the First World War, we also fought side by side during the Korean War and commemorated several Anzac Days together, except for the battle during the Battle of Kapyong, when the Australians were too busily engaged. But the Australian and Turkish veterans of the First World War actually served, or not veterans of the First World War for Australia, but one of the Turkish brigadiers had actually fought the Australians at Gallipoli and then fought beside them in Korea as well. So some great linkages there.
Coming onto the parade ground now is the contingent from the United States of America. They have a Marine Security Guard, a detachment, and they are led by Master Sergeant Alondra Bayliss of the United States Army Air Force. The USMC have been providing security for the US Embassy since its opening in 1943.
And that is one alliance that has done nothing but grow and strengthen in the years since World War II. And as we speak today, a very large number of Australian Defence Force members on exchange or otherwise training within the United States of America and in posts all around the world.
Absolutely.
Coming onto the program now are the Australian Army Cadets. And these cadets are from 224 Army Cadet Unit, which is a local Canberra unit.
Going strongly, it hasn't faded as a concept, Defence Cadets?
Not at all. I think it provides, even though I think it's a figure about a third of all cadets go on to join the military, but it gives them not only good standing for the military, but also good standing for their future life as well, just self-discipline and drive and a way to present yourself as well. But it's a great scheme that is still going strong today.
I began my career as a cadet, age 13.
And you're living proof you can go on and put another 50-odd years together beyond that, Phil Rutherford.
That was on top of the 50 years.
On top of the 50, okay.
Quite naturally, the Air Force cadets get a very large contingent.
Big moment for these young cadets to be here at the National Service, televised around the country today.
And they're led today by Flight Lieutenant Jeff Tanner, who's their commanding officer. And this is number 315 Squadron of the Australian Air Force Cadets. Also amongst the ranks are members of 327 Squadron and also 334 Squadron as well.
Following them, it's the relatives of all wars. The RSL made the decision some years ago that the relatives would be afforded their own special contingent, and were able to represent their fallen families in their own way.
Might have touched on this earlier, Phil Rutherford, just briefly at the time, I think, but your observations, I know before the ceremony began today, we were thinking numbers were a bit sparse, but they built up. How do you think this year compares to previous or recent previous years?
I think the numbers of the more current veterans are around about the same as they were, but certainly the numbers of veterans of the Second World War are much less than we've seen in the past. And some contingents, as we saw, they had no veterans at all. They had family members who were wearing their veterans' medals and representing them proudly, but unfortunately the veterans themselves are not here themselves to be honoured by the crowd.
Yeah. Which is to be understood with the passage of time.
Coming through now is the Legacy of Canberra in the vehicles, and amongst their number is Mrs. Judy Mack, who's the president of Legacy Canberra. And this is today's march is the first occasion where the widows and dependents of our veterans have formally taken their place in the march to represent their partners and or parents.
They are very much towards the end of this year's march. In fact, the very last contingent. We will just signpost at this point, with the march starting to wrap up, that at 12:30 Eastern Time, we'll be bringing you live coverage of the Anzac dawn service from Gallipoli. That will end the broadcast of this service, but it can still be watched via streaming or later caught up with on iView for the last, roughly speaking, 30 to 40 minutes of ceremonial proceedings here that continue beyond 12:30. We can tell you more about where to find that a little later, but there's no question that we will be bringing you the Gallipoli service at that time. So, very shortly, we'll be awaiting the ADFA Guard of Honour, which will return to the parade ground in preparation for the actual ceremony, the national ceremony. And today, His Excellency Sir Peter Cosgrove has joined us for what we've already noted is his last Anzac Day commemoration as Governor-General, and he'll be giving today's commemorative address. But each year he also records an Anzac address, and in this, again his last, he shares his vice-regal platform with younger ADF veterans as well.
Hello, Peter Cosgrove here. Anzac Day is a day for Australians to pause and remember those who fought and served and died in our name, for our nation, for us. In the last few years, much of the focus of Anzac Day has been on the centenary of the Great War and those diggers who fought so far from home. The legend of their mateship and gallantry has become so great, we hope to see some of ourselves in them. This is a day of memories, and for each of us, it means different things. Today we hear from servicemen and women who have their own special stories to tell.
At first, I did not participate in Anzac Day because I felt I'd not lived up to the Anzac spirit. And so that was a tough period of my life because I just had felt like I'd let Australia down because I, for whatever reason, didn't consider myself an Anzac.
In terms of what I think of Anzac Day, it's evolved quite a bit. When I lost the 5 guys in Malaysia, the first Anzac Day after that had even more personal meaning for me. And I've also lost colleagues on combat operations and many to suicide as well. So it's a really sombre and very personal day for me now.
We were 5 minutes out from landing. As the aircraft started lowering to prepare to land, we had lowered too far because we were unable to see the ground and had a hard landing into the desert floor at 215 kilometres an hour. All the passengers were flung out all along the way, except for myself and 2 others.
There was a time when I found it hard to attend Anzac Day ceremonies. It was a very private affair, one that I spent with my wife and my children. That extended also to my brothers, sisters, to my parents, and perhaps a phone call to 1 or 2 mates who I'd served with.
We are just very lucky these days. We choose to serve, and I think that over time there's been such a bold development of the Anzac legend that contemporary veterans don't like to associate them or don't feel like they can associate themselves with that type of legend. And certainly whilst you are still serving, there isn't a direct association with the Anzac tradition because of the significance of that story.
When I march with my fellas on Anzac Day, I'll always go in the ranks, not out the front, and on a file that is close to the crowd. And what I try to do as I march along is to look at every young kid, get eye contact. And what I'm thinking then is, we're doing this so you don't have to.
You know, Australia and New Zealand work beside and with each other. And for New Zealand, Australia is our closest defence partner. So everywhere we go and all our deployments, our exercises, our engagement, it is still Anzac, and we really do consider one another, and we are brothers and sisters in arms from way back in, 1915 to now.
And on Anzac Day now, I think of all those who went before us. I think of the men and women who sacrificed so much throughout the world wars in Vietnam and Korea and all of those wars. But now I think of the contemporary veterans as well. I think of those friends of mine who served, those friends who continue to fight their own wars every single day after their service. I think of those people.
I now realise that it's not about me personally. Anzac Day is about remembering everyone who has served Australia and New Zealand to bring about the amazing standard of living we have, the freedoms we enjoy. And for me now, that is what Anzac Day is all about, and that's what I hope to bring my children up to understand.
Back when I was a lot younger, before I first joined the Army, Anzac Day to me was to recognise all the older generations from World War I, World War II and Korea and Vietnam, but I never thought that I would be one of the veterans marching past and being honoured and respected. So
We, Australia at large, confer on them this honorific. They are Anzacs, and they do deserve to march. And the serious faces they show tell me that they're conscious of the legacy, and they'll carry that burden and that honour through all their lives.
Now I attend Anzac Day ceremonies in public as a show of support for those who were in that position before, who perhaps feel as if they can't attend.
So I think it's a real special day. It's a personal day, and it's a day of reflection.
There are just so many young men and women right now overseas who are continuing to serve our nation. And we need to think about those people on Anzac Day and their families as well.
This will be my last Anzac Day as Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief. I've considered it an absolute privilege to have served and been associated with the great men and women of the Australian Defence Force, and by association, their families and loved ones. For service past, for those who serve today, Anzac Day always has and always will be about those who serve, their stories and the sacrifices they make. It is on their conscience and courage that we live as we do and aspire for peace and prosperity for future generations. Lest we forget.
Almost signing off, but making sure that ingoing Sir Peter Cosgrove didn't make it about him, sharing in his message, his Anzac Day message this year, the moment, with other veterans as well. Now, the catapult party is making its way towards the Stone of Remembrance, the clearest indication we can get that we're about to enter the formal ceremonial proceedings from here.
Ladies and gentlemen, this year the commemorative address will be delivered by the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency, General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove.
For some here attending this moment in the national capital, and others like this elsewhere around the nation, this will be your first Anzac Day service. Some of you are youngsters, some are new to this nation. For all of those newly come to this national ritual, we expect that you will all be eager to understand what it is that draws us as a nation together so solemnly, more than 100 years after an event in a war so very far from our shores. On this day, 100 years ago, the Great War had been over for about 5 months. This great memorial campus here in Canberra had not yet been created, but all over Australia, in communities great and small, people gathered to rejoice the deliverance of the remnants of the flower of our youth from history's most terrible war. Equally so, probably more so, those gatherings mourned the dreadful loss of life in faraway places, the loss of innocence in hearth and home. In a nation of 5 million or so, around 420,000 of our men and women served in uniform in World War I. When the guns drew silent in November 1918, there were 95,000 Australians in France and another 60,000 in Great Britain. In the Middle East, there were another 30,000. Of course, I've not included the more than 60,000 lying in graves or whose remains lay unrecovered on the battlefield. Still, it was over. The war to end all wars had drawn to a close, and nations could now argue about the peace. Our men and women could come home. Imagine the excitement when the first contingent arrived back in Australia on the 3rd of December 1918. But the process must have seemed agonisingly slow to both the troops and, of course, their loved ones. The final troop convoy didn't arrive in Fremantle until late September 1919. While the fighting had stopped, before the AIF was eventually disbanded, another 2,200 of those men and women succumbed to wounds, illnesses and accidents. The grief of those families back in Australia is unimaginable. Every family in Australia that suffered a loss or received home a family member ruined by their war experience must have asked, why did they go? What was it for? Was it worth it? These questions were always justified then, and they're justified now. The Australia of 1914 was bursting with energy and optimism and innocence and the exuberance of liberty. Although we had the most profound historical, cultural and even legal ties to the mother country, Great Britain, nonetheless, there was a sense here of growing independence and of precious democratic freedoms. Setting aside the rising jingoism associated with threatening events in Europe, there was a natural foreboding in Australia that our peaceful future was inextricably linked to the balance of power over there. The growing threat of hegemonism invoked deep unease within Australians, from our national leadership to ordinary families. Of course, there was a veneer of naivety. There always is with the complex motivations of nations contemplating war. But afterward, those bereaved families, those shattered individuals returning to their homeland Australia, did cling to the notion that Australia stood up for what was right, even when the cost was awful. Let it be always thus. So for those who wonder why communities assemble on this day every year at dawn and later in the morning, as Governor-General, I say that in the gamut of motives, from the profoundly philosophical to simple curiosity, there is a fundamental reason. It is by our presence to say to the shades of those countless men and women who did not come home, or who made it back but who have now passed, and to say to their modern representatives, the ones around the nation who today march behind their banners, you matter. What you did matters. You are in our hearts. Let it be always thus. And now perhaps an insight as to why we veterans gather and march proudly behind those banners in our ranks of old. For the camaraderie, of course, and to honour those who faded from our ranks, gone but not forgotten, while there's a breath in any of us. But also because it symbolises for each of us that part of our lives which was once characterised by service before self. When we put aside personal safety and the comfort of hearth and home for the needs of our duty. You know, when we march, we like to look at those gathered to watch and wonder, young and old, family, friends and strangers, and to catch their gaze and convey our silent message. We did it for our nation, for what Australia stands for. We did it for you. Let it be always thus.
Your Excellency, thank you for those remarkable words. And the Memorial staff and Council would also like to express their gratitude to you for your unwavering support of the Memorial and wish you and Lady Cosgrove well for your upcoming retirement. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please stand for the hymn, O Valiant Hearts?
O valiant hearts, who to your glory came, through dust of conflict and through battle flame, tranquil you lie, your nightly virtue proved, your memory hallowed in the land you loved. Proudly you gathered rank on rank to war, as who had heard God's message from afar. All you had hoped for, all you had, you gave. To save mankind, yourselves you scorned to save. Splendid you passed the great surrender made into the light that nevermore shall fade. Deep your contentment in that blessed abode. Waits the last clear trumpet call of God.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Wreaths will now be laid in the following order. the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove, and Her Excellency Lady Cosgrove.
So this is not the end of formalities for Sir Peter or Lady Lynn Cosgrove. They have still a few functions to perform here today, but the laying of the first wreath is significant for them personally and symbolically for the nation.
Representing the Prime Minister of Australia, Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham, and the New Zealand High Commissioner, Her Excellency the Honourable Dame Annette King. These wreaths are laid together in memory of the significance of Anzac to Australians and New Zealanders.
We've explained already why Simon Birmingham is here on Scott Morrison's behalf, because there happens to be a federal election campaign underway, and Scott Morrison was up north in a garrison town, as was Bill Shorten, his opponent. One in Townsville, one in Darwin today. So representation, strong representation, lots of people being swapped in here, as you'll see, with wreaths being laid over the next 10 minutes or so.
Representing the Chief Minister of the Australian Capital Territory, Mr. Gordon Ramsay.
So Phil Rutherford, this is formality. We've seen it before, but we didn't get a chance as the catafalque party made its way down to the stone of remembrance. It's still there, to explain what their role is in this ceremony.
The stone of remembrance, it's actually known as the catafalque, and it was traditionally a raised bier or a raised platform upon which a coffin would be placed, and to enable people to come past and pay their last respects. When it came to a dignitary or a famous
representing the Speaker of the House of
general
Representatives,
or leader,
Mr. James
they would form a guard of honour around the coffin to ensure that it wasn't looted, or people would in other ways try to deface the deceased. The four members that we can see there are known as the catafalque party. They attend to their positions on each corner, facing outwards, their rifles upturned. It's lost in traditions why that happened. It was known that when King Charles I was executed, a soldier turned his weapon upside down as respect and was severely castigated for it. But in the years since then, it's become a formalised movement, drill movement. They are using the SLR 7.62mm rifles. It's a difficult movement to do with the shorter style weapons which the advocate are carrying.
The Chief Justice,
but they attended to their position with their rifles tucked under their shoulder, known as the reverse position. That was a specific drill movement formulated on the death of the Duke of Marlborough in 1722, and has been used ever since when accompanying a coffin.
Statue-like in their composition, you can see the legs of one member of the catafalque party there, and this is Susan Kiefel, the Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia, laying her wreath. Michael Kelly just reflecting on the commemorative address today. Two words stood out from Sir Peter in my ears. "You matter" was his message, really about the whole purpose of this occasion, held on the 25th of April each year. It is to send an emphatic message, isn't it, that people who have done deeds in the past matter and still matter.
Very much so. You see, from the Second World War and First World War, Second World War, up until the end of Vietnam, veterans were parading, but modern veterans haven't felt they could, or haven't felt part of that experience of Anzac, but they certainly, any man or woman that wears the uniform of this nation is part of that legacy and part of that legend and continues to grow it. And they should, and Peter's words were about them mattering too, and that they should be out marching in their formations for Anzac Days in the future.
Is there a reticence, do you believe, on the part of recently departed ADF members to participate in uniform, to march?
There is a little bit, I think, from what I've seen and spoken to a number of people. There are still a number of them quite badly affected by things they've seen or experienced in foreign fields. But I think they just don't feel that they are in that same mould as the men and women who've gone before. But they don't need to worry about that, because they certainly are.
I think John King, Phil Rutherford, who led the march today, said in interview with our reporter Georgia Hitch that they will get there when it feels right for them. I suppose in your circles over the years, and perhaps in your own experience, you will have encountered people who let it go for a few years but felt okay to participate at a later time of their choosing.
It took me some time after I came back from Vietnam to feel comfortable. We must understand that that conflict is a traumatic event felt by different people in different ways, and when returning from overseas and you find that the world has gone on while you're away, and you feel a certain disconnection from reality, from society, and it takes a little while to get your mind around coming back into the fold, and, as it were. It's not that people are not welcomed, it's just that sometimes it takes others, it takes them a little while to feel comfortable being back around familiar people in familiar settings.
Is it possible to observe here in 2019 that modern enlightened times, the country is any better at dealing with what might loosely be described as broken people who've served and come back wounded in some way, either psychologically or physically? Is the modern and recent experience of care and support any better or worse than in yesteryear?
My personal opinion is that there are issues that and challenges ahead, because we are in a society now where people are happy leading a life where they're on their iPhones, on their iPads, on their Facebooks. That even in military barracks, you find that people will knock off and go to their quarters and not be seen again until the next day, because they're connected to each other by the internet, or they're quite happy being by themselves. I think that sense of isolation is a challenge that modern technology is going to need to find ways of addressing. And I think it is a difficult task, and one that, but it is something that needs to be urgently addressed.
What do you think, Michael Kelly, the implications of that isolationism are for either the individuals concerned, or even if you want to speak more broadly about occasions like this? If people do retreat and not really emerge to celebrate or share their experience, does it pose not a threat, but does it present changes that will inevitably occur to the type of day we're witnessing here?
I think there's always going to be veterans who will come and march, but I think one of the things, I'm not a user of social media myself, but some of the friends that I've had that have served overseas have actually benefited through the use of social media, in the fact that, as Phil was saying before, one of them in particular had gone off grid. And it was through the use of social media that other friends were able to track him down and make sure that he was okay.
Right, so it's not all bad. Can be a force for good.
Absolutely, it can. It can certainly be used as a veteran contact network, and also to help people find meeting spots or places where they can catch up, even in situations where it's not Anzac Day, or just to make sure that they're okay and travelling well. So I think on base, I can't speak for what happens after hours, but for those that have discharged from the forces, it's certainly a way that they can readily keep in touch.
Well, that's an optimistic viewpoint, interpretation on a phenomenon which is not new. I mean, I listened this morning to the dawn service and Corporal Donaldson talking there. Really, since time immemorial, this is what war does to people. It inflicts enduring damage, psychologically or physically, some of which is coped with through the resilience of the individual, but in many cases not. And I suppose it's the challenge of the ages, past and future, that you as a society at least try to deal with it afterwards. Presenting and deploying troops into conflict is in many ways the easy part, isn't it? It's the long tail effect that continues afterwards.
I think something that many who have never experienced it don't realise is that conflict creates a new normalcy with people who have had to go through it. That life for them is never the same again. That they've experienced things that no one else will or should ever have to go through, and which is very fortunate for them. But it does bring a new focus on life, which never goes away. It will always be there, and it's being able to learn how to cope with that. That's the challenge.
As we watch those young cadets marching earlier, I imagine they are, like many generations before them, interested in involving themselves in some way with the Defence Force, but never truly believing that the next major conflict is one they're going to have to live through.
My father was totally against me joining the Army Cadets when I was at school because of his experiences during the Second World War as an anti-aircraft gunner on aircraft carriers being dive-bombed by the Japanese continuously in the Pacific for 3 years. It was only when the headmaster could convince my father that the school cadets were not going to be deployed to Vietnam that he allowed me to join the cadets.
Right. Slightly misleading information from the headmaster, but there you go. It later transpired that you were Phil Rutherford. Now, this is the last wreath being laid. And that, once completed, will lead us to the Creed. Now, that will be read today by Kerry Stokes, the chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial. The Creed is the solemn reminder of the birth of the Anzac tradition.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the reading of the Creed by the Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, Mr. Kerry Stokes.
On the morning of the 25th of April, 1915, Australians and New Zealanders landed under fire on Gallipoli. It was then, and in the battlefields which followed, that Anzac tradition was formed and the bond in which Australia and New Zealand now live was forged. Today, above all days, we remember those who served our nation in times of peace and in times of peace. We remember with pride their courage, compassion and comradeship. We remember what they accomplished for Australia and indeed for freedom and of mankind. We honour those who died or were disabled in the tragedy of war. Their stories adorn our nation's history. We grieve for the families of the fallen, particularly the war widows and the orphans.
Kerry Stokes, media proprietor and benefactor.
We recall with pride the selfless service of Australian men and women in places near and far, on battlefields in many lands, honour under the oceans, seas, waterways, and in the skies over many theatres of war and other operations. We remember those who have suffered as prisoners of war and those who died in captivity. We remember staunch friends and allies. Those who have served our nation have bequeathed to us a great legacy. May we and the generations to come prove worthy of their sacrifice.
now finished. Kerry Stokes, yes, media proprietor and benefactor to the War Memorial, as well as being the chairman of its council.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing while we
to hear
join together
from
in
the
the
Royal
singing of the
Military
hymn.
College Band, which will lead the hymn Abide With Me.
Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. Swift to its close, ebbs out life's little day. Earth's joys grow dim, its glories pass away. Change and decay in all around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me. Hold thou thy cross before my closing eyes. Shine through the gloom and point me to the skies. Heaven's morning breaks and earth's vain shadows flee. In life, in death, O Lord, abide with me.
God, stand up! Hey!
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing as the representative for the National President of the Returned and Services League of Australia, Mr. John King, recites the ode. After the ode, the last post will be sounded, followed by a minute's silence and the rouse.
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
God, stand! Stand! God, present! Arms!
Lest we forget.
God stand up! Hey!
Stand up! Hey!
Okay, in silence and with great solemnity, the nation has observed the Anzac tradition this year, 2019, as it does from this location and many others around the country and around the world on the 25th of April. This one just happens to be a glorious Thursday in the nation's capital of Canberra.
Please be seated.
And that also marks the major ceremonial formalities of this national service. We will see the Guard of Honour
This morning, our commemoration
stand at ease. In fact, we already have seen them do that, with a few procedures still to bring to viewers. Just to indicate, though, that as we approach 12:30, our broadcast coverage of the remainder of this ceremony will not continue, but you can continue to see elements of it if you wish by streaming the video or by catching up with it later on iView. So we are committed to going to the Gallipoli dawn service as we approach 12:30 Eastern Australian time. So that will be done, and they've actually run Phil Rutherford in a timely fashion this year. It may be an indicator of a few things. I suspect one you've already spoken about, which is just the thinning of the ranks. There are some years, particularly those big centenary years approaching 2015 and then in 2015, where I think there was a lot more to get through.
That's true, Greg. The length of the march is sometimes totally dependent on the weather. We had one march a couple of years ago where the march was over and done with very quickly because of the rain. Today we thought it would be a little slower because of the number of more elderly veterans in the beginning of the march, but that's certainly finished on time, and the whole ceremony has been flowed very smoothly. I think the producers are going to be very happy with the way it's gone today.
Yes, Michael Kelly, the conditions really couldn't be any better here in Canberra, and I don't know what happens for you, but for most of the veterans who've participated here today, what lies next typically on an Anzac Day once the formalities are dispensed with?
I think once everybody's finished for the day, then there's a great deal of catching up with old comrades in various places, two-ups involved as well, so the only legal day of the year where it can be played here in Australia, but there's plenty of that going on as well in services clubs, not only here in Canberra but around Australia, but I'll do my utmost to try and catch up with some of my old comrades around the place today as well. But
Yep. Sporting events, lots of Anzac tradition still to be observed in settings away from this place. So we're going to leave you with the music very shortly of our guest performer here today. We'll go to that, but we will, before we do so, just indicate that our broadcast version of proceedings here is wrapping up within minutes so that we can take you to the Gallipoli Peninsula and the dawn service there. That's going to begin at 12:30 sharp, with a 1 minute gap between our broadcast here and that beginning. So we'll thank at this point Michael Smith and Phil Rutherford for joining our coverage of this, the national service, from Mike Kelly. Sorry, Mike, I'm trying to listen to the music, which is lulling me into nonsense here as we wrap up our broadcast. Yes, but thank you to both of you. We'll continue, as we say, on a streaming basis beyond 12:30 and sign off for now to the music of Fred Smith, and wish you the best on this Anzac Day 2019.
To clear the road so we may pass. They're always out front, and when they bear the brunt, man, it happens fast. Sapper D. Smith had a wife and a son, the apple of his eye. Snowy Moreland was just 21, way too young to die. So soldiers, sing me your sapper's lullaby. You give it your all, knowing if you should fall, that all good things must die. So go call your mother, call your old man on that welfare line, and tell him you love him while you still can, 'cause all good things must die. Soldiers, sing me your sapper's lullaby. You give it your all, knowing if you should fall, that all good things must die. All good things must die.
Fred, thank you. Such a poignant tribute to our young servicemen and women, and a reminder of the grim realities of war. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Fred Smith and his musicians once more. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please stand and join in the singing as the band of the Royal Military College Duntroon leads us in the National Anthem of New Zealand and the National Anthem of Australia.
God ascends! God presents!
Atava make this commonwealth of ours renowned of all the lands. For those who've come across the seas, we've boundless plains to share. With courage let us all combine to advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
God stand up! Hey!
And stand at ease.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a few moments we'll have the pleasure of witnessing right above us a Royal Australian Air Force formation flypast consisting of 3 Hawk 127 fighters. Now please be advised, these aircraft are rather loud. They're on their way now, and these aircraft are operated by Number 76 Squadron at RAAF Base Williamtown near Newcastle. And 76 Squadron is a Royal Australian Air Force flight training squadron. And here they are. Ladies and gentlemen, the catafalque party will now dismount from the Stone of Remembrance.
And I can. Jump. In 1, 10. Catapult party. Quick. March.
God stand up! Hey!
And stand at ease.
The Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove, will now move to the saluting dais, where he will receive a royal salute to mark his departure.
God stand! Jump!
And I can. Jump.
For the final time, we would imagine. Sir Peter standing for his last salute. This at the end, not only of a Governor-Generalship, but
Defence Force Academy! Royal salute! Present! God stand! Jump!
yes, not only at the end of his Governor-Generalship, but a long and distinguished career in military life and public life of Australia. Not quite done, though. He and other VIPs will shortly be heading up through the Hall of Remembrance and into the War Memorial. We'll bring you that in a moment. But yes, the lead-in fighters have gone, and noisy though they are, they're not quite the loudest planes in the RAF fleet. Mike Kelly, I think we've been rocked in previous years by everything from F-111s way back in the day through to F-18s, and I suppose into the future, the next breed of stealthy fighter for Australia, the Joint Strike Fighter, will probably make an appearance here one day.
Just been taking a look, but
with messages of hope and of thanks for those who have served in Australia's name. These
Rolls over the top of
crosses
you.
have been placed
They're quite a spectacular aircraft.
Yeah, it's quite a different noise proposition when that one roars through. Today's planes are a small starter plane really for members of the RAF to learn jet flying skills before they progress on to the bigger machines. And so, yeah, we're seeing the VIP element of today's service led by the Governor-General. There are a number of them. They'll take a few minutes to relocate themselves up into the War Memorial itself and the Hall of Remembrance, and there'll be some further wreaths laid there as the Guard of Honour prepares to leave us for the final time today. Temperatures here in Canberra have not been excessive. In fact, they've been very pleasant in the low 20s, but I can be certain that each and every member of that guard would be experiencing a couple of degrees higher temperatures than we are up here on the lush lawns of the Australian War Memorial. And yet, like Kelly, not one of them has wilted. There's been no problems today.
No, they've. I think one did go earlier on, but managed to be snuck off very carefully. But there's a lot of radiant heat coming out of those parade grounds, having experienced them firsthand, and you're always up preparing for the night before, so you'll be feeling the pinch about now. So,
well spotted you. I must have missed that one out the corner of my vantage point here. Hard to be avoided, really, under the circumstances.
Very much so. I mean, their winter dress is quite heavy and does retain a lot of heat, but they've done an immaculate job again today, and their drill's been perfect.
As an old soldier who started his days wearing heavy AB boots, also known as ammunition boots, and thick, heavy gaiters, it's pleasing nowadays to march in the more comfortable R.M. Williams boots that they're issued with. Although the heat does come up through the feet very much when you're out there on the parade ground.
There are actually things, aren't there, Phil, that they can do to drill and work up some resilience to what might otherwise be the inevitable fainting?
Well, every parade you're reminded that you need to breathe. You can't stand there and hold your breath like many of us used to, but wiggling the toes and flexing the knees keeps the circulation going in the feet. Thinking of odd things, keeping the mind active.
So the Guard of Honour, which you can hear, is now leaving the parade ground, which brings us up to the wreath laying, the tomb of the unknown soldier.
I must say that the band has been exceptional again, under Major Darren Cole and Waros Carrick. Again, they've done the Army proud.
Special preparation going into this particular occasion, or they're just job ready all the time?
They practice. They practice quite a lot, as was mentioned earlier on. They're a very versatile band. They have their own little sections that play at different festivals and different occasions around town. They have jazz ensemble, classical ensemble. They quite often to be heard in town at Music at Midday, providing entertainment at the entertainment centre.
There's no shortage of occasions where you see them out and about in this city, the capital of Australia, as we look inside the Hall of Memory. And shortly, in the usual order that we've seen elsewhere today, here we go, led by the Governor-General and Lady Lynn Cosgrove. Tributes to be paid. That at the tomb of the unknown soldier. This is a relatively brief ceremony. involving members of the VIP dignitaries. Andrew Lee, Simon Birmingham, Andrew Lee representing, I believe it's the opposition leader Bill Shorten. Simon Birmingham's role we've already explained. Dr. Lee accompanied by one of his sons. And New Zealand represented, just as Australia is in the relevant ceremonies held across the ditch on this day. And Mike Kelly, this is really the soul of the Australian War Memorial. You work here, study here. Just explain to us the significance of the tomb of the unknown soldier.
He was laid to rest on Remembrance Day in 1993, and the remains are of an unknown soldier taken from the Adelaide Cemetery just near Villers-Bretonneux in France. And he represents all the men and women who have died for Australia over war and peacekeeping and warlike operations over the last, well, since Federation, basically. He was laid, as I was saying, with a great speech by Prime Minister Paul Keating at the time, and he now serves the purpose of not only ceremonial events, but his tomb looks out across to the new and old Parliament House, and if you open up the doors, and I thought this was an apocryphal story until I saw the documentary with Annabelle Crabb. When you open up all the rooms, doors in a straight line into the new Parliament House, it ends up in the room where the decisions are made that send our Australian men and women to war, so that he serves that purpose to remind our modern day politicians as well about what decisions can make. But
yep. Brendan Nelson, the outgoing, soon-to-be outgoing Director of the War Memorial. He's just laid his floral tribute, and he is certainly an individual who has transformed this place, the War Memorial. But going back to Mike Kelly's observations about the opening of this by Paul Keating, the former Prime Minister, actually some of those words that he used that day have rung through time into the lyrics of songs. He is one of us. He is all of us. It's taken on a life of its own, hasn't it? That speech and that particular room.
Very much so. Those words still ring loud today, and as you're saying, through the songs and things like that. But it was very much a heartfelt speech, and I remember this during my service time. We'd stopped to listen to this, and it was quite poignant, and continues to remain so as well. And now, having worked here for as long as I have, it still rings true today for current servicemen and people past as well.
We'll wrap up very shortly. Just going back to the name I mentioned a moment ago, I appreciate that indirectly, at least, Mike Kelly is your boss, but because you are a, quote, insider, unquote, change that has been brought through this institution, it's very much a public place now. Very few visitors come to Canberra without calling in here. Change for the better, would you say?
I think so. I think looking at the public profile that Brendan Nelson has, and it really has raised the profile of the War Memorial, not only around Australia, but around the world as well. And it's largely down to his personality and drive that the memorial has had that public face. But I think the people who really deserve the credit are our visitor services officers who work within the building, who deal with our visitors, over 1 million visitors now every year, and it's largely down to them as well that we get our return visitors, and they do a wonderful job.
And even after he walks off the stage, Brendan Nelson will have left a legacy with plans, a master plan, in fact, for really big developments here into the future. But it's approaching 10 to 1 in Canberra and along the eastern seaboard of Australia. And the official part of this Anzac Day ceremony for 2019 is all over. And so at this point, we're going to farewell our audience, but not before we say a very big thank you to our expert commentators, Major Phil Rutherford, retired, and to Mike Kelly. Thank you to both of you as ever, and we do hope to see you back in 2020. ready for yet another Anzac Day service. Please enjoy the rest of your Anzac Day, both of you, Mike
Greg.
and Phil. So I'm Greg Jennett, and on behalf of our team here at the War Memorial, we're going to say thank you and farewell for joining, first of all, our broadcast, and farewell to enjoy your Anzac Day.